The roar of an FJ Holden tearing down your street. The sound of milk bottles clinking on your doorstep before sunrise. Teenage girls lining the streets to catch a glimpse of the Beatles. And the sweet chatter at a corner milk bar on a scorching summer afternoon. If any of that jogs your memory, you already know what it was like to grow up in Australia during the 1960s, when everything was shifting beneath our feet. Yet somehow, life still felt simple and certain. It was a world of its own, a time when Sydney beaches were packed with surfboards and milk bars stood on every corner, when kids watched black and white telly after school and families drove their Holdens with pride, when fish and chips came wrapped in newspaper and nobody locked their front doors. If you grew up in Australia in the 1960s, these moments are engraved in your memory. And as we walk through them, one detail at a time, you'll see just how vivid it still feels. It started with screams that could shatter glass. In June 1964, 4 lads from Liverpool stepped off a plane in Sydney, and Australia lost its collective mind. The Beatles had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same. Teenage girls lined the streets from the airport, pressed against barriers, crying, fainting, reaching out desperately just to touch them. Every radio station played their songs on repeat. Kids saved their pocket money for weeks just to buy a Beatles record. If you had a gramophone at home, you were playing it until your parents begged you to turn it off. Boys grew their hair longer, trying to copy that mop-top look, much to their parents' horror. Suddenly, every teenager in Australia wanted to look like John, Paul, George, or Ringo. The old crew cuts and neat partings were out. Long fringes and shaggy styles were in. The Beatles proved that working-class lads with guitars could take over the world. And if you were a teenager in Australia in 1964, you felt like anything was possible. That tour changed Australian youth culture overnight, and the echo of those screams still rings in the ears of anyone who was there. But while the Beatles were making fans scream in concert halls, another revolution was happening on the beaches. If you grew up in coastal Australia in the 1960s, your weekends revolved around sand, surf, and the sound of waves crashing. But the beach belonged to 2 very different worlds, and they didn't always get along. First, there were the surf life-saving clubs, the clubbies. These were organised, disciplined, and serious about saving lives. They marched up and down the beach like soldiers, wearing their neck-to-knee costumes and caps. Then, there were the board surfers, the new wave. These blokes didn't care about marching or competitions, they just wanted to ride. In the early 60s, surfboards were still heavy hollow timber planks, but by mid-decade, lighter foam and fiberglass boards changed everything. Suddenly, surfers could turn, carve, and dance on the waves. It was freedom, it was rebellion, and the clubbies hated it. They saw surfers as reckless show-offs who got in the way of real life-saving. Surfers saw the clubs as stuck-up and old-fashioned. If you were a kid near the coast, you either had a board or you wanted one. You'd spend hours in the water, sunburnt and salty, riding wave after wave until your arms couldn't paddle anymore. And no matter how much time passes, that feeling of catching your first real wave stays with you forever. Of course, not every teenager was hanging out at the beach. Some had a completely different vibe. If you weren't a surfer, you might have been a bodgie, or a rocker, or at the very least you knew one. These were the rebels, the ones who dressed sharp, drove fast, and made their parents nervous. Bodgies had been around since the late 40s, but by the early 60s, they'd evolved into rockers. Working-class lads with slicked-back hair, drainpipe jeans, and an attitude that said they didn't care what you thought. They loved rock and roll. Their uniforms were leather jackets, tight jeans, and Cuban-heeled boots. Some had motorbikes, others had cars, And if you had a car, it better be something special. You'd spend hours in the garage with your mates, tinkering, polishing, making it perfect. Then you'd cruise down the main drag, radio blasting, looking for action. Milk bars were the meeting spots. That's where rockers gathered, sitting on bonnets, smoking, talking about cars and music. The girls, the widgies, had their own style. Short hair, tight pants, and an edge that matched the blokes. The older generation didn't know what to make of them. Newspapers wrote panicked articles about youth gone wild, but it wasn't about causing trouble. It was about being seen, about refusing to blend into the background. By the mid-60s, the rocker scene started fading as new subcultures took over. But if you were part of it, even for a moment, you felt like you belonged to something bigger than yourself. You weren't just a kid from the suburbs. You were part of a movement. And after a day of cruising or causing a bit of harmless mischief, most kids would head home just in time for the telly. Television was still magic in the 1960s. Most families only had one set, and it sat like a throne in the lounge room. Black and white, of course. Colour wouldn't arrive in Australia until 1975. But that didn't matter. When your show came on, nothing else existed. For younger kids, afternoons meant Adventure Island. It started in 1967 and ran 5 days a week on the ABC. Then there was Mr. Squiggle, the puppet with a pencil for a nose who lived on the moon at 93 Crater Crescent. Generations of Australian kids grew up with him. And let's not forget Blackboard, the grumpy character who'd groan and complain through the whole episode. Television wasn't something you had access to all day. There were limited channels. The ABC was the main one for kids. Commercial stations had shows too, but nothing beat the ABC afternoon lineup. There was no recording, no pausing. If you missed an episode, that was it. So you made sure you were home in time. Parents would use the telly as a bargaining chip. Finish your homework, clean your room, then you can watch. And you'd do it because missing your show wasn't an option. Television brought families together too. After dinner, everyone would gather to watch the news or a variety show. Those grainy black and white images might seem ancient now, but back then, they were a window to the world. And for kids in the 60s, that window was everything. Before the sun came up, before the birds started singing, you'd hear it. The quiet rumble of the milk truck rolling down your street. Then the gentle clink of glass bottles being placed on doorsteps. It was the soundtrack of every Australian morning in the 1960s. In winter, the cream would rise to the top and sometimes freeze, pushing the cap up like a little tower. Kids would fight over who got to pour the cream into their porridge. In summer, you had to grab the bottles fast before the sun warmed them up. The milkman wasn't just a delivery driver. He was part of the community. He knew everyone. Kids would sometimes wake early and run outside to watch him work. He'd always have a quick chat or a joke. Some milkmen even knew your dog's name. They were reliable in a way that's hard to find now. Rain or shine, hot or freezing, the milk always arrived. By the late 60s, things were starting to change. Cardboard cartons were being introduced. Supermarkets were popping up, selling milk in different sizes and flavours. But for most of the decade, the milkman was as much a part of Australian life as backyard cricket. And once you'd had your milk and breakfast, there was one place every kid wanted to go. The milk bar wasn't just a shop. It was the centre of your world. Every suburb had one, usually on the corner, run by families who worked 7 days a week. Greek and Italian immigrants owned most of them. You'd walk in, and the bell above the door would jingle. The smell hit you immediately. A mix of fresh bread, newspaper ink, and something frying in the back. The counter was lined with glass jars filled with lollies, milk bottles, musk sticks, juffers, fantols, all sold individually, You could walk in with a few pennies and come out with a small paper bag full of treasure. The milk bar sold everything: newspapers for your dad, bread and milk for your mum, ice creams and soft drinks for you. And if you were lucky, a spider. That magical drink made with ice cream and fizzy soft drink. You'd sit at the counter on a spinning stool, slurping it slowly, making it last as long as possible. By the end of the 60s, supermarkets were starting to muscle in. Coles and Woolworths opened big stores where you could buy everything in one trip. It was more convenient, sure, but it wasn't the same. If you grew up then, the milk bar was more than a shop. It was a second home, a place where you felt known and safe, where a few coins could buy happiness, and where, for a moment, the whole neighbourhood came together under one roof. And speaking of things that defined Australian childhood, there was one TV show that captured the imagination like nothing else. If you were an Australian kid in the late 60s, you wanted a pet kangaroo. And it was all because of Skippy. The show launched in 1968 and became an instant phenomenon, not just in Australia, but around the world. Skippy the bush kangaroo told the story of a clever kangaroo and her human friends living in Waratah National Park. Skippy wasn't just a TV show. It was a symbol of Australia. Kangaroos, bush, adventure, mateship. Everything that made the country special was wrapped up in that half-hour program. Schools would empty out on Skippy afternoons. Kids would race home, throw their bags down and be glued to the screen by the time the theme song started. It was wholesome, exciting, and uniquely Australian. No fancy special effects. Just good storytelling and a country's most iconic animal as the hero. The show ran until 1970, but its impact lasted far longer. If you grew up in the 60s, Skippy was part of your childhood. But while Skippy was teaching kids about friendship, the whole country was learning something new about money. Valentine's Day, 1966, wasn't about love. It was about dollars and cents. After decades of pounds, shillings and pence, Australia was changing its money. Decimal Currency Day, C-Day. It was one of the biggest logistical operations the country had ever attempted, and everyone had an opinion about it. Every shop, every bank, every school was talking about it. The old system was complicated. 12 pence to a shilling, 20 shillings to a pound. Doing math meant carrying, converting, and constantly checking. The new system was beautifully simple. 100 cents to a dollar, $2 equaled £1. When the 14th arrived, it was surreal. People lined up outside banks, excited and curious. They wanted to see the new money. Some people took to it immediately. Others struggled. Grandparents especially found it confusing. Not everyone was happy. Others worried Australia was losing part of its British identity. But most people saw it as progress. Australia was modernising, becoming more independent. C-Day proved that Australians could handle massive change without falling apart. It felt like the future had arrived, and in a way, it had. Football, meat pies, kangaroos, and Holden cars. That jingle said it all. If you grew up in Australia in the 1960s, you were either a Holden family or a Ford family. And if you were a Holden family, the FJ was probably your first love. The FJ Holden rolled out in 1953 and became an instant Australian icon. By the 60s, they were everywhere. Tough, reliable, and distinctly Australian. That big chrome grille, those rounded curves, the way it handled rough country roads without complaint. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. Built in Australia by Australian workers. By the mid-60s, newer models had arrived. The Holden launched in 1963 and became the fastest-selling Australian car ever. Then came the EK in 1961, which introduced automatic transmission to thousands of Australians for the first time. By 1966, the HR hit the roads. Stylish, powerful, and sporting the legendary 186 cubic inch engine. Then there was the Combi. The VW Combi van became the ultimate family vehicle. You could fit everyone in: kids, dogs, camping gear, the lot. Some families would pack up and drive across the country for weeks. These weren't just cars, they were memories on wheels. And for Australians in the 60s, Holdens and Fords were part of who you were. But speaking of traditions that defined the era, there was one that was uniquely Australian and completely ridiculous. 6 o'clock closing, 3 words that shaped Australian drinking culture for decades. Pubs had to close at 6 in the evening. It was a rule left over from World War I, meant to keep workers sober and productive. But by the 1960s, it had created something absurd: the 6 o'clock swill. Blokes would finish work at 5 and race to the pub. They'd have 1 hour, 60 minutes to drink as much as they possibly could before the doors closed. And they made it count. The scene was chaos. Pubs packed wall to wall with men in work clothes, shirts rolled up, ties loosened, shouting orders at barmen who couldn't pour fast enough, beer slopping everywhere. You'd order multiple beers at once, line them up on the bar, down them as fast as you could, then order more. The goal wasn't to enjoy the drink, it was to get as much in before the bell rang. Barmen worked like machines, pulling beers, taking money, moving on to the next bloke. The floors were slick with spilled beer, the air thick with cigarette smoke and sweat. And it happened every single night across the country. By 6, the bell would ring. Barmen would start collecting glasses, even if they were still half full. Men would scull whatever was left and stumble out onto the street. It was a strange ritual. Everyone knew it was stupid. Everyone complained about it. But it had been that way for so long, change seemed impossible. The law was meant to promote temperance, but it did the opposite. It encouraged binge drinking. It made pubs unpleasant places. It took away any social aspect of having a beer. Through the 60s, pressure mounted to change it. People argued that Australia was behind the times. Other countries didn't have these archaic rules. Slowly, states started relaxing the laws. New South Wales extended hours in 1955. Other states followed gradually. By 1967, Victoria moved to 10 o'clock closing. Tasmania went even later. It took until the early 70s for 6 o'clock closing to completely disappear across Australia. But for most of the 60s, it was still there. The packed bars, the desperation, the bell at 6, the stumble home. It was a ritual, bizarre, and uniquely Australian, just another part of what it meant to grow up in 1960s Australia. But while blokes were racing to the pub, a different kind of music was taking over the beaches. Surf music exploded in the early 60s, and Australia rode that wave hard. It started in America with Dick Dale and the Beach Boys, but Australian bands grabbed it and made it their own. Suddenly, every surf club had dancers on the weekend. Teenagers packed in, doing the twist, the stomp, the boogaloo. The music was fast, twangy, and impossible not to move to. It was the perfect soundtrack for a generation that lived for the beach. Australian bands like the Atlantics and the Denver Men cranked out surf instrumentals that got every kid on their feet. Surf music wasn't just about the songs, it was about the culture. Bob Evans, a clubbie who saw the future, started organising dances at surf clubs to cash in on the craze. He also launched Surfing World, one of Australia's first surf magazines. Evans understood that surfing was becoming bigger than sport. It was becoming lifestyle. Music was a huge part of that. Bands would play at beach festivals, surf competitions, and club events. The music brought surfers and non-surfers together. Even if you couldn't ride a board, you could dance to surf music. Even if you lived inland, you could feel connected to the beach through the sound. Radio stations jumped on board. Surf music got airtime alongside the Beatles and local rock and roll. DJs would announce surf conditions between songs, and surfers would plan their days around those reports. But here's where it got interesting. Rockers hated surf music. They thought it was lightweight and fake. Real music was rock and roll. Elvis, Chuck Berry, gritty, rebellious stuff. Surf music was too clean, too happy. This created tension. Rockers and surfers already clashed over beach territory and style. The music divide made it worse. Different tribes, different sounds, different worlds. Sometimes it boiled over into fights. Nothing major, just kids being territorial, but it added an edge to the scene. If you were a surfer, you wore board shorts and had sun-bleached hair. You listened to surf music and spent your days in the water. If you were a rocker, you wore leather and denim. You listened to rock and roll and spent your nights at milk bars and car parks. By the late 60s, surf music was fading. Psychedelic rock and heavier sounds were taking over. But for that golden period in the early to mid-60s, surf music defined Australian youth culture. It was optimistic, energetic, and undeniably Australian. It was the sound of sun, salt, and freedom. If you were there, you remember the feeling. The music would start and suddenly everyone was moving. Nobody cared if they looked silly. It was about letting loose, about being young, about feeling the rhythm of the waves in the music. Surf music didn't last forever, but its impact did. It put Australian surf culture on the map. It gave a generation a soundtrack. And decades later, when you hear those opening guitar licks, you're right back there. 14 years old, dancing at the surf club, not a care in the world. Friday night meant fish and chips. The smell would hit you from down the street. Your mouth would water before you even walked through the door. And chances are, the person behind the counter was Greek. Greek families dominated fish and chip shops across Australia in the 60s. They'd come to this country looking for opportunity, and they found it serving flake and chips to hungry Australians. These families worked together. Mum, dad, kids. Everyone had a role. The older kids would work the counter while parents fried in the back. Younger kids did homework between serving customers. The menu was simple: fish and chips, potato scallops, dim sims, maybe a hamburger or a pie if you were lucky. The fish was usually flake, which is actually shark, though nobody called it that. It was cheap, tasty, and there was plenty of it. You'd order at the counter, and they'd wrap everything in newspaper. You'd carry it home, the bundle warm in your hands, trying not to peek inside, and steal a chip before you got there. If you ate it straight away, standing on the street corner with your mates, it was perfect. Hot, crispy, salty, the vinegar soaking through the paper, the fish flaking apart in big white chunks. Greek cafes were everywhere too. Every country town had at least one. They weren't serving Greek food, mind you. That would come later. In the 60s, Greek cafes served what Australians wanted. The mixed grill was the signature dish. Steak, sausages, bacon, eggs, chips, tomato, piled high on a plate. The cafes were social hubs. Blokes would come in for a feed and stay for hours, drinking tea, smoking, talking about footy or politics. The owner would join the conversation, offering opinions while clearing tables. It was community. These Greek families became part of the fabric of Australian life, even as they held on to their own culture at home. What's interesting is how this started. The first Greek to open a fish and chip shop in Australia was Athanasius Comino, way back in 1879 on Sydney's Oxford Street. He saw a Welshman running a shop and thought it looked like a good business. He was right. Camino opened his own shop, and it sparked a chain migration. Brothers, cousins, people from the same island. They all came to Australia and got into the business. By the 1960s, thousands of Greek families were running fish and chip shops from Sydney to Perth. It gave them a foothold, a way to support themselves while learning English and adapting to Australian life. Their kids grew up Australian, Aussie accents, Aussie friends, but Greek at home with the family. The relationship between Greek families and their customers was special. You'd chat about the weather, the local footy team, the price of fish going up. If you were short a few coins, they'd let it slide. They remembered your usual order, asked about your family. It was personal, and Australians in turn showed loyalty. You had your fish and chip shop, the one your family always went to. You wouldn't dream of going anywhere else. That trust, that connection, it mattered. By the end of the 60s, Australian food culture was starting to shift. More migrants from different countries brought new flavours. Italian restaurants were opening. Chinese takeaway was becoming popular. But fish and chips remained the king of Friday night, and Greek families remained at the heart of it. Looking back, it's remarkable how seamlessly these families integrated while maintaining their identity. If you grew up in the 60s, fish and chips wasn't just food. It was a ritual, a treat, a taste of Friday night freedom. And the Greek families who served it weren't just shopkeepers. They were part of what made Australia home. But as the decade came to a close, Australia was changing in ways nobody could have predicted. The suburbs were exploding. Drive through any Australian city in the 60s and you'd see it. New streets, new houses, new shopping centres, post-war prosperity had arrived and families were cashing in. The government was pushing home ownership. Banks were lending, and suddenly the Australian dream was within reach for ordinary working people. Rows of brick veneer homes spread out from city centres. 3 bedrooms, a lounge room, a kitchen, a backyard. It was modest by today's standards, but back then it was everything. Families moved out of cramped inner-city terraces into these new suburbs. They had space, privacy, a place to call their own. The mortgage might have been tight, but it was worth it. 2-car families were becoming normal. Dad had the sedan for work. Mum had something smaller for shopping and school runs. This changed everything. Women gained mobility. Independence. They could drive to the new supermarkets that were popping up everywhere. Coles opened its first freestanding supermarket in North Balwyn in 1960. Woolworths followed with one in Warrawong the same year. These weren't corner shops. They were massive, aisles and aisles of products, everything under one roof. You could do your whole weekly shop in one trip. Park the car, fill the trolley, load the boot. Done. It was convenient, modern, and exciting. The old way of shopping daily at small local shops was fading. Supermarkets offered choice, lower prices, and the thrill of self-service. But it wasn't just shopping that was changing. The whole culture was shifting. The swinging 60s had arrived in London and were now washing up on Australian shores. Young people were challenging everything their parents believed. Miniskirts appeared on Australian streets. Girls wore their hair long and straight or cut it short in geometric bobs. Boys grew their hair past their collars, despite schools and parents demanding they cut it. Fashion was becoming bold, colourful, expressive. The generation gap widened into a canyon. Parents who'd grown up during the Depression and the war couldn't understand their kids. Young people saw their parents as stuck in the past. The country was waking up to the fact that the old ways couldn't last forever. The 60s ended with Australia on the cusp of massive change. Women were demanding equality. Young people were rejecting everything traditional. The suburbs kept spreading. Supermarkets kept opening. Television got bigger. Cars got faster. But underneath all that progress and prosperity, tension was building. The 1970s would bring it all to a head. But for those who grew up in the 60s, it was a unique time. You could still feel the safety and simplicity of the old Australia. The milk delivered to your door, the corner milk bar where everyone knew your name, fish and chips on Friday, Skippy on the telly. But you could also feel the new Australia emerging, louder, faster, more diverse, more questioning. It was exciting and unsettling in equal measure. If you grew up in 1960s Australia, you witnessed a country transform from black and white to colour, from closed to open, from certain to questioning. Those memories, the sounds, the smells, the feelings, they don't fade. They're part of who you are. The clink of milk bottles, the roar of an FJ Holden, the taste of a spider at the milk bar, the excitement of Sea Day, the chaos of Beatlemania, the magic of Skippy, the salt and sun of the beach, the twang of surf music, the wrapped bundle of fish and chips. These weren't just moments. They were your childhood, your Australia, and no matter how much time passes, when you close your eyes, you're right back there, standing in the milk bar with coins in your hand, watching the sun set over the beach, feeling like the whole world was ahead of you. If any of this brought you back, hit subscribe, share it with someone who remembers, because these memories aren't just yours. They belong to a whole generation who lived through something special, something that can never quite be captured but will never be forgotten. The 1960s in Australia, a decade like no other.